Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining on Zoom. Um, my name is Kadir Ustun. I'm the Executive Director at the SETA Foundation at Washington, D.C. Today, we are hosting a panel of experts to discuss Israel's potential and impending annexation of significant portions of the West Bank. Our event is titled Israeli-Palestinian Conflict from Peace Process to Annexation? Since the announcement of Trump peace plan in January as the solution, quote unquote, to the decades-old Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the expectation for Israel to annex parts of the West Bank has become an increasing likelihood. The recently established unity government in Israel is set to present a plan to the Israeli parliament at the beginning of July 1st, to be precise, on extending sovereignty to the West Bank. It remains unclear how far Israel is willing to go and what reaction it will trigger from Palestinians. Would it lead to an escalation or renewed conflict? Will such a move lead to a strong or more muted response from the regional powers? How will the Israeli-Palestinian conflict evolve after this? What happens to the two-state solution? So these are the questions we had in mind, and as we discuss these, more will emerge, I'm sure. To discuss these questions, we have Geoffrey Aronson. He is the chairman and co-founder of the Mortons Group, a strategic consultancy. Mr. Aronson has been a commentator on key political, economic, and security challenges across the Middle East and North Africa. He was the research director of the Foundation for Middle East Peace from 1992 to 2014, and he originated and edited the Foundation's bi-monthly report on Israeli settlement in the occupied Palestinian territories. We also have Khaled Elgindy. He's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. He directs the Institute's program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. He's the author of the newly released book, Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump, published by Brookings Institution. Prior to Brookings, where he worked 2010 to 2018, he was an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel from 2004 to 2009. He was also a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations of 2007 and 8. And we have Lara Friedman. She is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Lara is a leading authority and voice on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, with particular expertise on the Israeli-Arab conflict, Israeli settlements, Jerusalem, and the role of the U.S. Congress. She has widely published in the U.S. and international press. She's regularly consulted by members of Congress and diplomats, policymakers, journalists around the world. I'm going to go for a shameless self-promotion. We have recently published an edited volume titled Trump's Jerusalem Move, Making Sense of U.S. Policy on the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. This was edited by myself and our research director, Khaled Elgindy. Lara was one of the contributors, and her chapter was titled Taking Trump Seriously on Jerusalem. You can reach this publication free of charge at our website, www.setadc.org, setadc.org. So following this shameless self-promotion, I'd like to move on to our panel discussion. I'm going to simply start with some questions and ask our panelists to respond. So the very first question, I want to turn to Jeff and for his answer. Will this annexation create a new round of conflict if and when it happens? It's supposed to happen sooner rather than later. Jeff, what is your take on that? How you wrote a piece on this recently.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone who's attending today. Historically, it's not a great bet to bet against conflict in this part of the world. Determining when and under what particular circumstances things are going to break down is less certain, obviously. But it's clear that we're at a transition point in the conflict, and it's important to ask, why now? Why has annexation suddenly come to the fore in these last few months? And I think as we project toward the future, it's important to understand the 3 or 4 main points that I would make about that. The first one is the failure of the failure to implement, generally speaking, the international consensus, most recently represented by the Obama presidency. After 2014, or since 2014, there's been no framework for engaging the parties. This is, in a sense, unique in the last generation and a half, beginning in 1967 in the post-war era. So for the first time, there's been no acceptable framework. Secondly, you've had combined with that, the almost total discrediting of the Oslo process among Palestinians and Israelis alike. We see that with on the Palestinian side, in a sense, the rise of the Islamists embodied in the Hamas movement, and on the Israeli side, the end of a discussion within Israel about support for Palestinian state, which has absolutely disappeared from their internal political agenda. The third thing is Trump and the opening that he's offered for Israel to, which of course has proceeded without interruption, but politically to prepare
Geoffrey,
the ground for American support.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Geoffrey.
Yeah.
Can you repeat what you said starting with Trump, because there was a problem with your voice?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, Trump has opened the way for Israel not only to prepare on the ground, which it's been doing without interruption since 1967, but to prepare politically, to prepare the important groundwork politically for an American green light, and to transform diplomacy, as Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, from a question of how much Israel is prepared to concede on the West Bank to one in which the question is, how big a bite is it going to take?
Thank you, Geoffrey, explaining those 3 dynamics. I want to move to Khaled. Khaled, in particular, perhaps Palestinians, how do you expect them to react to this potential impending annexation?
Yeah, thank you, Kadir, and thank you to everyone out there who's tuned in. Let me first start by saying I agree with Jeff's analysis about kind of how we got to this point and why now. I think it's important, the only quibble I would have is I would sort of conflate some of the things that he pointed out as factors. I think the answer to the question of why now is that we had a vacuum. We had a political and diplomatic vacuum precisely because of the collapse of the Oslo process. The process has basically run its course many years ago and effectively ceased to exist. At some point during the Obama administration, we could say it was 2012, or maybe it was the collapse of the Kerry negotiations in 2014. But in any case, by the time Trump came, there wasn't anything that we could reasonably call a peace process. Not in terms of negotiations. Most aspects of the roadmap, of course, were completely ignored. Most aspects of Oslo had fallen by the wayside, with the notable exception of things like security coordination. And now that last sort of remaining vestige of Oslo is also being shed, this time by the Palestinian leadership in response. So I think that is maybe a good segue to how the Palestinians have responded in terms of their leadership. So far, the Palestinian leadership seems to be trying to impose a cost on Israel for going ahead with annexation and for even discussing or debating the issue internally in the cabinet or in the Knesset, that they are trying to make clear that annexation is a red line for them that jeopardizes everything, including, I think, hinting very strongly that it could jeopardize the very existence of the Palestinian Authority itself. That said, as you know, as I noted already, the Palestinian leadership, as part of that decision to create a cost, has decided that they're going to sever security ties with Israel. With the idea being that Israel needs to be aware that if there is no PA Israel security coordination, the very existence of the PA is itself in jeopardy, which means that they may have to look forward to ruling directly someday over the population centers in the West Bank. They haven't explicitly said they would dissolve the PA. If anything, they've said that they wouldn't, but it's intended, I think, to be sort of a shot across the bow. The problem with this approach is that it doesn't seem to be attached to a broader strategy of how we get to what is their ultimate goal, which is a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders. It's extremely difficult to imagine how simply severing security ties with all that entails, and refusing the transfer of tax money that accounts for at least 2/3 of the PA's budget, when it is already suffering from a major financial crisis, independent of the problems associated with combating COVID and so forth. It's very hard to imagine or see how it is that we go from this existential threat that they are proposing to an independent Palestinian state. The Palestinian leadership has not articulated a plan for the day after annexation. What does it mean legally, politically? Does the PA's very existence in that context, for example, amount to a de facto legitimation of the Trump plan, which requires a Palestinian interlocutor of some sort? And so if you have to sort of put it in simple terms, if the Trump plan refers to a Palestinian state, however we may understand that that does not actually comport with most traditional understandings of sovereignty and statehood, at the very same time that the Palestinian leadership is referring to themselves as the state of Palestine, does that sort of inadvertently play into this sort of annexation plan, whether or not it's actually intended? And so I don't think the leadership has clarified any of these points. They seem to be playing a game of chicken, but it's not clear at what point that they're really expected to jump out of the way.
Khaled, just quickly follow up to what you said. If there's no plan, then and then security cooperation won't happen, do you see particularly conflict between, let's say, security forces in the authority, Palestinian Authority, to get into, some sort of clash with the Israelis? Do you expect some sort of spark on the ground like that?
It could happen, clearly. I don't think it is the desire of the Palestinian leadership to have that happen. I think even though their rhetoric is quite bold, they have, I think they're sticking to sort of a literal definition of security coordination. They are not talking directly to their Israeli counterparts, but they are talking to the Israelis through intermediaries, through various third parties, we've seen a couple instances where even though there isn't direct coordination between the parties on the ground, there is some sort of communication happening where the Israeli army moves into a certain area and we see Palestinian Authority forces leaving that area at the same time. So there's clearly some form of communication. They clearly don't want to see chaos. They don't want to see armed militias sort of re-emerge and taking over the situation on the ground. They are trying to maintain law and order. But at the same time, they're walking this delicate balance between trying to send this very strong message that they mean business, but while trying to maintain some semblance of the status quo ante to keep things from deteriorating. But it's you know, these things have a way of taking on a life of their own.
Thank you, Khaled. I want to turn to Lara for her remarks in response to what I asked earlier. Lara, you, as I mentioned in your chapter, you mentioned that, you know, you discuss how we need to take Trump much more seriously, and his plan has been announced through his advisor and son-in-law Kushner, and now that's being implemented. So I guess you're, you know, you warned us a while back, we need to take it seriously. How do you see US policy evolving with this annexation, impending one?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me, and it's a great panel. I think my entry point, I don't really disagree with anything either of my colleagues have said. My entry point for analyzing the Trump administration, though, starts at a slightly different place. I think there has been, since the day Mr. Trump was elected, there has been, from the political analyst world, a preference or an automatic logic of using the same analysis to try to understand what he would do, why he was saying what he was saying, as any other administration, right? So if he said he was going to move the embassy, there was analysis of, well, he doesn't really mean it, and here's what will happen if he did, and this is why he won't. There are articles by learned members of the foreign policy community explaining why he will never move the embassy, he'll never change policy. There's headlines like, he's going to be tougher on settlements than Obama was. Look, he's being tougher on settlements. I think the policy community has been incredibly slow to understand, and remains, continues to have difficulty understanding what it means to grapple with an administration that is not acting based on what have historically been the rational foreign policy parameters that have guided presidents from both parties. Whether you liked or disliked their policies, you could at least understand them and have a conversation about, like what you're saying, will this spark conflict? Will it destabilize? This administration doesn't care about that question. So I still see articles in the past few days saying, here are all the reasons why strategically annexation is bad for Israel. And I said to someone the other day, that's sort of like trying to explain to somebody why it's so important to keep abortion legal. But if you're talking to someone whose perspective is God gives life and life begins at conception, all of your arguments logically, you're talking right past them. Taking this administration seriously means actually believing them. We have a president who enjoys, I've said this before, killing sacred cows and grinding them up for hamburger simply for the sake of doing it and undoing what previous administrations have done. And he has handed from day one his Middle East, his Israel-Palestine policy, over to ideologues, people who are unapologetically, unabashedly motivated by an ideological agenda. So taking them seriously would have started from 3 years ago, listening to them when they basically said, coming into office, their goal was to erase the Oslo process, erase the peace process, roll US foreign policy back, not just to pre-Oslo, but to pre-Madrid, and get us back on a footing which says there is one sole legitimate actor between the river and the sea, and that is Israel. And it is righteous in doing anything it does. And it is the only actor that has legal claim to land or to ruling people. And that really is where we are. You know, annexation has been a process that has been going on for decades de facto. I think it's worth recognizing that, you know, if 4 years ago, when Obama was still in office, people like me talked about de facto annexation. We were accused of being hysterical. There is no annexation, everything's temporary. The amount of time it took to shift from an absolute denial of de facto annexation taking place to an open discussion of legitimacy of how much Israel will annex and when it will happen, it happened like that. And it happened because we have an administration which has put the full weight of US policy behind that. And that's where this goes. You know, what to expect between now and the end of the Trump administration, again, I think it starts with taking them seriously and believing them when they say that this is in their eyes, you know, Judea and Samaria belongs to Israel and the Jewish people. And when our ambassador to Israel says we, meaning the Jewish people, have claim to this, it's very strange as an analyst to ask people to reorient their thinking to an ideological perspective. If you fail to do that, then you are constantly running up against the illogic of this administration's approach. If you can stop for a moment and put yourself in ideological shoes, then everything they have done has not only been predictable, they have told us they were going to do it, if only we had listened.
Thank you, Lara. I assume that you see this annexation basically just, you know, delivering on their open promise of recognizing de facto realities on the ground. I'll ask you more about the U.S. policy going forward and potential, you know, Biden administration. But let's say that for now, and I want to turn to Jeff. Jeff, when you look at Israeli calculations at this time in history, what do you see? Like, there's been a lot of discussion about now Netanyahu has to deliver what Trump basically gave him a big gift, and he has to do it soon before November elections in case, you know, Trump loses. What is Netanyahu's calculations, and how do you see Israel's position? I mean, those political calculations can end up sort of hurting the broader sort of Israeli interests as you might see it, or as others might see it. So what is the calculation in Israel right now?
Well, there's an expression that goes something like this: watch what you wish for because it might come true. Certainly Netanyahu and actually a broad consensus within Israel after decades and decades of occupation naturally have created a growing affinity with the idea of de jure annexation, given the fact, especially that de facto, you know, since the end of June 1967, Israel has remained, has been the sole sovereign west of the Jordan River. So, that's number one. Now, he's wished for annexation in a sense, and his call has been answered, as Lara pointed out, by this administration, creating, in a sense, for Netanyahu a trap of sorts. Now, he has to make good on this desire on his part because he's put it out there. Failure to annex today, a complete collapse of this concept is intolerable for Israel, not only in the Likud, but the members of the nominal opposition. Israel cannot afford to be seen by people around the world, and especially its neighbors, as pulling back from a strategic objective which they themselves have articulated and gone to great lengths to win US support for. It will undermine, to some degree, their strategic position in the region. So on that basis alone, the idea that Netanyahu is just going to forget that this ever happened is, I think, a dream. Why don't I stop there?
Thank you, Jeff. Khaled, I saw a news piece, I think it was from the Palestinian Authority. I can't quote the name, apologies for that, but they were saying that they could actually enter into talks with Turkey to claim their exclusive economic zone in the Mediterranean, the gas, etc. You mentioned earlier kind of de facto accepting the Trump plan. Would something like that fit into that framework you mentioned? Are the Palestinians going to end up, um, you know, keeping stability and then focusing on some economic issues? Then that's kind of what Trump plan says they should. Do you think we are headed that way?
Well, I'm not familiar with the details of the example that you gave, but I think in general, I think the answer is yes. I think there is a real risk that the absence of a meaningful strategy on the part of the Palestinians and just kind of inertia, just continuing to move and drift in the same direction that all these trends have been drifting in, will sort of inadvertently legitimize what Netanyahu and the Trump administration have in mind with regard to annexation. Obviously, the Palestinians are the weakest party in this whole scenario, whether we're looking at bilaterally with the Israelis or trilaterally, including the United States, or multilaterally, including the region and other stakeholders. The Palestinians are, I think, objectively the weakest actor in this whole process. And so if they're going to assert themselves, they have to do so very deliberately and in a concerted way. And it's very difficult to imagine how they do that, just given the nature of the state of Palestinian politics, being divided and not having a functioning parliament, whether we're talking about the Palestinian Authority or the PLO as an umbrella, as the address of the Palestinian national movement globally. These institutions are completely stagnant and have been for many years. There's an ongoing division internally. It's hard to imagine how you assert yourself when you're already the weakest party, when you've kind of imposed another layer of weakness on yourself, which is this division and dysfunction that exists on the Palestinian side that is mostly self-inflicted. Palestinians can't unilaterally change the outcome on the ground. They cannot remove the Israeli army. They cannot change the diplomatic equation. They cannot raise they cannot make the Palestinian issue a top-tier priority for the international community. But they can take certain things into their own hands, like fixing their own situation. Part of that is economic, but I think a bigger part of it is political. The Palestinians have for years complained that people try to reduce the Palestinian issue to one of standard of living or economics or even security or humanitarian issues. And that they are, they have emphasized their political personality, their political identity. And yet what we're seeing is this decay and decline of Palestinian institutional politics that is theoretically within their own hands. And they are sort of abandoning that for a variety of reasons, of course, and not necessarily consciously. But this division and institutional decline certainly inhibits Palestinians from expressing their political identity on the international scene.
Thank you, Khalid. Just for clarity, this was PA's ambassador to Ankara. He mentioned that they would be interested in a deal with Turkey on exclusive economic zones, but you don't have to go back to that question, but I want to ask you a follow-up. In this situation, then, when you look at the region, do you see any sort of consequential allies in the region that could have a reaction to the annexation that would change anything, that would make an impact? Do Palestinians have allies in the region?
I mean, that's a very good question. The Palestinians don't seem to have very many allies in the region. But well, actually, let me use a better word than allies, because allies is sort of a term of art. But they don't really seem to have many friends in the region, and that is, actors who would otherwise, be willing to support them directly or indirectly. I would say maybe the Jordanian regime is an exception, because for them, annexation in any part of the West Bank poses an existential threat to the Hashemite kingdom, in ways that it doesn't necessarily present to other states in the region, whether we're talking about Egypt or the Gulf states or other, traditional Arab allies of the Palestinian cause. But that said, I do think that we could and probably should be seeing more vociferous opposition from places like Egypt. Egypt is obviously historically a friend of the Palestinians. They have a peace treaty with Israel. They're a stakeholder in many different respects. And yet we've seen a very muted response from Egypt with regard to possible annexation. I think a clearer response from Cairo, as well as from Riyadh and other Arab capitals, that there is a great deal at stake if Israel moves ahead with annexation, including the possibility of threatening the existing peace treaties that Israel has with Arab states, whether in Egypt or with Jordan. And we haven't seen that yet. We haven't seen the Arab states kind of raise the level of alarm to match their rhetoric, which so far has been very critical, but they haven't really done more than issue statements.
Thank you, Khaled. Lara, Trump administration, has allies in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, as Khaled discussed a few of them in terms of their response. That kind of response, if there were one that was robust, do you think that would have an impact on Trump administration's calculations, calling? I mean, I'm sure they're not going to condemn this anytime soon. On the contrary, they have encouraged this, and they expect Netanyahu to actually deliver on this. But are there regional powers, places of influence that can have an impact on the Trump administration on this issue?
It's I'm not fond of doing the crystal ball thing. I mean, I guess it's possible. Logically, from what I've seen of this administration's decision making so far, specifically in Israel-Palestine, I would observe that they believe, it's almost a sort of sociopathic thing, like, we'll do it, and you'll either agree with us, or you'll see that we were right and you'll agree with us after the fact, or you'll have to accept it. There's nothing you can do, no matter what, so we're just going to do it. This is what happened with Jerusalem and the embassy and the Golan. And my guess is that that is the logic when they see language from the UAE that's not supportive of annexation, or people warning that there might be violence. Look, their argument is, you said the region would explode if we moved the embassy. The region didn't explode. By the way, not all of us said the region would explode if you moved the embassy. You threatened that there would be, XYZ would happen. It didn't happen. I think this administration is committed to the course that it's on. It is difficult for me to imagine at this point, after 3 years of delivering piece by piece by piece on what they said they would do in Israel-Palestine, with there being no cost from the international community. Just look at Europe. I mean, you can wonder, well, what if Europe finally says, no, we draw a line? Europe has drawn many lines since this administration came into office. And each time a line is crossed, they say, well, but we have to wait. Now we have to wait. You know, they've done this, but they haven't actually moved the embassy. Well, they moved the embassy, but they haven't formally changed policy on settlements. Okay, well, now they've annexed the Golan and they've articulated language which says that it's okay to keep land if you've gotten it in a defensive war, but we don't know if they're going to apply that to the West Bank. Now we have the Trump plan, which is a plan for annexation, but we have to see if there's something in there we can work with. I mean, at some point, again, putting yourself in their shoes, what they have seen is we can move ahead with what we want to do, and there is no cost. And why would we suddenly change our mind now? And if you look at the articles coming out in Israel Hayom, which is the paper that belongs to Sheldon Adelson, who's a huge donor to the Republican Party, I mean, essentially the argument is don't worry about the Arabs saying they don't like this. They have to. They don't really mind. They're just saying what they have to say. They won't really object. The world won't really object, and the Palestinians will suck it up, and there won't be consequences.
Lara, then if there is another administration, as I asked earlier, if any of the do you think any of these dynamics are going to change in terms of U.S. policy? So many things seem to have been taken off the table, quote unquote, in the conflict and the negotiations. A Biden administration, what would they do based on what's happening right now? It's
a great question. I mean, all of us here in Washington, we all know people around the various campaigns. I think it's pretty clear from what we've heard from the Biden camp so far that there is a preference for not making this a major issue, which one could understand. This is one of those issues that you start spending political capital on and it just burns up and you get nothing for it. That being said, I think it is useful to look and see, well, what could they undo, for example? What is it possible to roll back? If one believes the Trump administration, then I think one has to assume there will be some form of annexation before Mr. Trump leaves office, if he does leave office, assuming he isn't reelected. So that means a new administration comes in with the reality of an embassy in Washington, in Jerusalem, recognition of the capital in Jerusalem, annexation that's been recognized by the United States, et cetera, et cetera. Some of that I think can be rolled back. It's rolled back at a high political cost. I mean, if a new president comes in and says, we are going to de-recognize annexation, I mean, that will come with a political cost. And the question is, what do you get for that? If the US, I've been fond of saying now for a few years, or certainly for the past year, opposing annexation is great. If you're not actually going to oppose the de facto annexation that's underneath it, then you're using up political capital to oppose a word. And not actually stop the process. I don't know where the energy is going to be for that political capital. And the broader question, which came up in your framing, where does US policy go sort of generally? And Khaled wrote a book about this. US policy for the past 25 years or so, certainly since the start of the peace process, has been incredibly adept at accommodating itself to whatever Israel does. I mean, it's sort of like you lay down a principle, whether it's principle of a negotiated settlement that both sides have to agree to, and the negotiated two-state solution. That's awesome. We started saying two states, but the principle is constantly being reoriented and reimagined in order to accommodate whatever fait accompli has most recently been put on the ground by Israel. And I suspect that's what we're going to see with annexation. And that's what we had laid out for us in some ways in the op-ed this weekend from the Israeli ambassador to the US, the sort of partial, it's not a complete annexation, and it's going to be gradual, and it'll really open the door for peace. I mean, it's talking points for a US policy which says, we are now going to accept whatever Israel does and move forward using the same talking points we've used for the past 25 years. And I think that's a real challenge to say to an incoming president, no, you need to resist that and do something harder, with no obvious prospects for success in getting to Israeli-Palestinian peace or changing the status quo, and spend a lot of political capital pushing in a different direction. It's very, very difficult.
Yeah. Thank you, Lara, for those. I want to start taking questions, and Geoffrey, this question is about the Israeli government. Does Israeli government or parts of the Israeli government really care about the opposition to unilateral annexation? by all Arab governments to one degree to or another. Khalid discussed the reaction from the region after my question. How do you see that? Does the Israeli government really care about the regional response?
Well, they care. The question is mine.
Jeffrey, you're gonna have to repeat
Israelis
yourself.
essentially
I'm sorry. You're gonna have to
I'm
repeat
sorry.
yourself because the voice
Okay.
coming in and out.
Okay.
Go ahead.
My response is certainly they care about the response to countries in the Arab world and beyond. But the fundamental question is this: is Israel prepared to define the parameters of its policies in a way that gives preference to the preferences of their antagonists in the Arab world and elsewhere? And the answer, of course, is no. It's always been no. If that had been the case, there would be no occupation, right? There would be no annexation of Jerusalem. There would be no 500,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank, et cetera. So Israel, of course, has worked very hard and very successfully in order to maintain the sovereign power it has to make its own choices. So in that sense, its friends and enemies alike are prepared to think whatever they choose. And again, had Israel defined a policy of occupation that, let's forget about Egypt or Syria, for example, if it had done what the US preferred it to do after 67, right? When the occupation in the UN was defined by George Bush in 1974, right, as illegal and an obstacle to peace, then there would be no occupation. There would not be the question of annexation even close to being on the agenda. The issue is Israel has been successful enough to be able to define more or less for itself the choices it wants to make. And now they have, instead of an antagonist in Washington, they have a partner. Now the partner is unstable. The partner, as we've seen in Syria and elsewhere in Korea, can change its ideas on a dime. So Israel, like everyone else, has to be careful not to become too enthralled by voices of support it may hear from Washington. And Netanyahu has done a tremendous job by staying out of the raindrops and not getting wet when it comes to playing the Trump administration correctly. Now, in the last few weeks, we've seen reports, oh, the Americans are having second thoughts about annexation. Why don't you do it X, Y, and Z, and so forth. Most of this, I believe, is noise. And secondly, to the extent it's not noise, it's a reflection of the fact that the Trump administration, from one moment to the other, has a hard time maintaining a consistent point of view.
Jeffrey, maybe Lara.
Sorry,
Lara, I was gonna push back for you actually, and I was gonna tell you to comment on this because you argued that they've been very consistent on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to, I agree generally with Jeff on this. I will push back. You know, the argument that this administration is erratic or unstable, I think applies across the board on almost every issue. It doesn't apply in Israel-Palestine. This president has had the same people leading his Israel-Palestine policy since the campaign. And I remember the voices, you know, during the campaign when people like me were talking about David Friedman and Jason Greenblatt, and we were told, no, those are just hanger-oners and kibitzers, and once he got into power, the serious people will take over. And he got into power and he gave them the most senior roles, and they have been the only change has been Greenblatt leaving, and now he's playing the same role from the outside. I think it is notable that on Israel-Palestine, this may be the issue where they have had the most policy coherence and consistency of any issue for the life of this administration. And I think expecting or anticipating that people who anticipate that change or who are looking for that fracturing We've heard noises about that since day one about fracturing, and it hasn't been true. I think expecting anything but continued coherence and consistency is mistaken.
Thank you, Jeff. Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I agree. Compared to their policy on Syria, for example, this has been a shining light of consistency. However, my main point is, if you're Bibi Netanyahu, you take things for granted at your peril, and that no matter how consistent the Americans have been, he owes it to his own policy process and to his own maximization of his own interests to tread lightly on this and not to become enthralled by the supportive voices he's been hearing. And I would imagine that you know, he's a fairly level-headed guy and has not let this blank check go to his head. And that's the secret of his success so far, when others have been burned.
Thank you, Jeff. There's another question. Back in the old days, there was a cost to proclaiming support for a two-state solution. Today, it feels like saying you support a two-state solution is the safest way to avoid acknowledging the obvious, especially for progressive, except for Palestine Democrats, i.e. Booker, Harris. Will annexation change that? Is there any possibility annexation will force politicians to consider alternatives or admit they're comfortable with what's essentially the A word? Perhaps Lara, can you comment on that?
Look, I mean, I think we'd all say pretty much the same thing. I mean, the term two-state solution, the phrase "I support the two-state solution" has been largely hollowed out of meaning for a long time. It has been used by folks on the left who maybe believe 100% what they say, but aren't always prepared to go to bat for the actual policies that are the problem. And it's been used by people on the right when they actually mean something that doesn't have anything to do with, as someone said earlier, anything that anyone would recognize as an actual state. If annexation happens, I mean, all signs are that the centrist democratic language, if you look at what's coming out of Mr. Biden's camp, we're going to keep using this language because it's the safe, comfortable language, sort of Obama era, even if it has lost even more meaning. And Ambassador Dermer's op-ed suggests that one should continue using that language as if it has any meaning. Is it going to get easier, though, and more challenging for that to be defended, or easier for people to say what you're essentially doing now is repurposing words to have another way of saying apartheid? Yeah, and that's where this heads. I mean, the situation we're going into is going to be undeniably closer to what people would look at as apartheid than something that leaves open things for a two-state solution. But I don't expect that language to change anytime soon.
Thank you, Lara. Khaled, I wanted to turn to you. If you have comments about what Lara said, go ahead, but there is a question about Egyptian threat of military intervention in the Libyan crisis. Does that have anything, what are the possible implications of that for the unfolding crisis of catastrophic proportion in historic Palestine? I mean, I guess the question, the logic of it is if Egypt can be emboldened to have a stronger role. This is kind of, I asked you already, but this is coming from the audience. Please.
Before taking on the Libya-Egypt question, I just wanted to add to the point that Lara made, which I agree with completely. And I think there's actually a downside I think a lot of people are hoping for a Biden administration would take a very different approach, but I think there's a potential downside in the sense that it's so easy to distinguish yourself from the Trump administration's approach that simply talking about undoing the things that Lara pointed out, all of the damaging policies that Trump has put in place, that even if you're not actually undoing them, but talking about undoing them sounds like progress. because the alarm is such, people are so alarmed by what Trump is doing that it's very easy to embrace the status quo ante, when the reality is that the status quo ante is exactly the path that got us to where we are. And so that's the contradiction. And one thing I've learned is that this thing called a peace process, and those who embrace it, has an enormous capacity to accommodate contradictions. The essence of US policy for a quarter century was, we oppose settlements, we embrace Resolution 242, we want an end to the occupation, and yet everything that it did in those intervening 25 years were directly in conflict with that. We don't like settlements, but let's sit down with the Israelis to figure out exactly where and how they can continue to build in the settlements. We don't call, we want an end to the occupation, but we're not really going to focus on the occupation as the major driving force of this conflict. We're going to focus on things like Palestinian institutions and building up the Palestinian economy, because they're easier, because they're lower hanging fruit. And so the fear is that, at least my fear is that it will be so easy to talk about two states without actually having to do anything, simply because you're not Trump, because you don't embrace these very clearly dangerous policies. So there is that, I think, real danger going forward. As far as the question on Egypt and Libya, I think it could go the other way as well. It's, yes, on the one hand, an example of Egypt taking an activist role to a situation that poses a strategic challenge to Israel's borders. The same could be said of the Palestinian issue. Obviously, the border with Gaza being the most, I suppose, the most ready flashpoint that could explode, and we've seen many times that it has. And so, Egypt has a direct interest in stability on its eastern border, the way it does on its western border. But there are, I think there are some real differences in the sense that just looking at the role of the Trump administration is much murkier when it comes to the situation in Libya than it is with regard to Israel and the Palestinians. And so there's a higher cost associated with taking a position that is directly confrontational with the United States, not to mention Israel, and many of the Gulf states. The Gulf states feel that they have aligned interests with Israel. I also think that there's a bandwidth question. If Egypt is prepared to put boots on the ground, I think in the worst case scenario in Libya, then it has less capacity to do something with regard to the Palestinian issue, whether we're talking about something on the ground or simply a diplomatic initiative. We've already seen that in Egypt, that is not distracted, and Egypt has many distractions, including the Renaissance Dam dispute with Ethiopia that also implicates Egypt and Sudan. So Egypt has many strategic priorities and threats that it's facing that rank higher than the Palestinian issue right now. And so if anything, I would see any sort of action in Libya as more reason for Egypt to kind of recede into the background.
Thank you for that, Jeff. I want to turn to you. This question, Israel may be a nation, but is it Jeff, are you online with us? It froze, I think. Then I'll turn to Khaled. Khaled, there is this question about the Palestinians. What ability does Palestine have to counter a forced annexation from a security standpoint? Assuming they wanted to resist this, right? What are the chances of being able to kind of resist it militarily, I guess?
Well, I mean, if the question is what can they do militarily, I don't think there's a lot they can do militarily on the ground to resist annexation. There may be a lot that it could do politically, starting with the internal Palestinian situation, maybe building a new Palestinian consensus rather than simply clinging to old formulas of the past, like the quartet and the Olmert negotiations. These are the things that they are. That the leadership is now talking about instead of something new and different that could actually inspire Palestinians. One step they could take is political. Another is they could, based on a new Palestinian national consensus, that could change their diplomatic approach. Simply hearing from different Palestinian voices. One of the problems with the Palestinian leadership right now is that it is such a small circle of people who are around Abu Mazen and his decision-making process, even within Fatah. Never mind, ostensible opposition groups or other factions, but it is a tiny group within Fatah that is advising him on these issues, and now those voices haven't changed for many years. And so simply broadening the conversation internally among Palestinians, I think could produce a very different dynamic, but we don't see the Palestinian leadership moving in that direction. I think, that is one reason why when the two-state solution dies, and it is definitely trending in that direction, if it's not already there, that one of the key forces will be this dysfunctional reality that exists on the Palestinian side.
Thank you, Khaled. From you, I've been hearing basically the key for the Palestinians is political unity. It's a question of politics more than anything else internally. Jeff,
or at
I
least
want to turn to
political
you.
coherence. It doesn't have to be
Yes.
political unity, but political coherence.
Yes. I guess their internal disagreements, you're putting a lot of emphasis on that. Thanks for that. Jeffrey, we lost you there a little bit, but there's this question:
I'm back.
Israel may be a nation, but is it a state? Israel has no defined borders, no constitution, no Israeli nationality, and a different recognized capital from Israel's stated capital by all the world's major nations except the US. Annexation only extends the non-state. Shouldn't other nations recognize that they have ambassadors in a non-capital, in a non-state, and remove their ambassadors?
Not likely. I don't think you'd find many people who would basically agree with the assessment and the consequences. Israel is sovereign. It has an army that controls de facto borders and recognized borders alike. And it, like many states in the world, historically, is still in a process of becoming, in the sense of establishing borders that are settled and that are maintained peaceably over the generations. So we may have problems like the ones that the questioner has articulated, but even so, notwithstanding all of those, Israel counts itself among the sovereign states of the world, and in some part is one of the strongest states, if for no other reason than the fact that is one of the very few nuclear powers.
Very quickly, Jeff, there's a question about UN. Will UN be of any assistance? If we connect that to the earlier question, the non-recognition of this annexation is almost certain by most world powers, let's say, except for the United States. Does that have any importance?
Well, again, when you're an Israeli decision maker and you're sitting around the table and you look at the UN and you say to yourself, am I going to define my policies that would win support and approval from the UN? Is that the sole or perhaps overwhelming consideration I need to make? The answer, of course, is no. And it hasn't been, and it's been no for generations. Some people may remember that David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, dismissed the UN, which after all had been responsible for recognizing the state of Israel's existence. He dismissed it as, he called it shmum. So it's a factor. It's something that Israel has to be aware of. But again, it's not going to define the parameters of what Israel is prepared to do.
Lara, very quick, two last questions for you. Isn't Jared running the show? This is a short question. And then, do we see action on annexation from the Trump administration in the near future as a sign that this relationship will be a priority within the next 6 months due to Trump's term ending? This question is without acknowledging possible pushback from the international community and unforeseen pushback from Palestine itself.
So I have no personal access inside this administration to tell you whether it is Jared or someone else. My impression, having been an avid observer of this administration since the election, is that the most consequential figure in defining what US policy has actually been, not about who's writing plans and who's organizing conferences in the Gulf, but the person who actually has articulated policy from the beginning, which is what we're seeing today, is Ambassador David Friedman. And that has been from day one to the present. And when there has been a disconnect between the sounds coming out of Washington or the sounds articulated at a conference in the Gulf and what is actually being articulated by the ambassador, the actual policy has been consistent with what the ambassador has been saying. So I am highly skeptical of those who say that Jared is running this. I think one would do well to have to give the respect that is due to the figure that is the ambassador, who came in with a clearly defined political agenda, whether you like it or not. It is a well-defined agenda based on long-held and deeply held positions, which have systematically been transformed into US policy. And the question of whether or not we see annexation between now and the end of the administration, I would refer people to Ambassador Friedman's speech at AIPAC, not last year, but the year before, where he made a spectacular speech. It was like someone preaching, a rabbi from the Bima. And he basically spoke in the tones of an orator about, how would we look our children in the eyes? This is not a direct quote, but this was the essence of it. If we failed to make good on all of these things that are necessary for what is good for Israel, while we have the most pro-Israel president in history in office. And what he essentially laid out was, we have to do all of this because he might not be reelected. I think that window of opportunity, which is a view that is shared by the far right in Israel. I don't know exactly where Mr. Netanyahu comes out on this, but the far right in Israel is aligned with our ambassador. I wouldn't be surprised if we had a situation today where, to some extent, the US policy is more extreme on this than the policy of the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, but it's very difficult to not defer to that. So I do think we're going to see action before the end of this administration on this. And this is the last thing. Again, they had a laundry list of things they were going to change on Israel-Palestine. They have made good on every single one of them. This is the final piece of it. So I think one should give them the respect they deserve and take them seriously, that they actually mean this and they are going to go ahead on it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I just want to end with a broad question. Where are we headed? And I'm going to make a very bad comparison, but with the, Floyd protests, we saw that, long-running institutional sort of injustices and these issues that have been kind of swept under the carpet, and that often people feel like there's nothing to do about it except for, you know, occasional. All of a sudden, you have one incident and things, you move on to a whole different framework. It would. I know you don't want to look at a crystal ball, Lara, but in these discussions, but I'm trying to see if there could be a moment like that in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, where all of a sudden we are at a place where we have all the parameters of frameworks, existing frameworks, kind of shatter, and then we move to a new discussion. This could very well be apartheid. This could very well be something else completely. I'm going to directly ask you to simply speculate and see how you're seeing what could come in a situation like that.
Very quickly, I think that's where we are. I don't think it requires a crystal ball. The two-state paradigm is now, it doesn't exist any longer. It exists still in paper and in talking points, but on the ground it doesn't exist. It's not implementable. The US and Israel don't support it. It now really only exists as a safe harbor for people who don't want to talk about how things really are, or for people who want to bash the Palestinians and say they're not a partner for peace because they will not entertain a Trump plan, which is really a plan for apartheid. So I think we're already at that point of shattered paradigms. Where it goes from here, it's a great question. I mean, on the positive side, shattering this paradigm, releasing people from the handcuffs of a two-state process, which was leading in the opposite direction. I mean, it opens up some interesting questions about where activism will go, where grassroots activism will go. You know, the last decade of rising terror about BDS, which has been just fascinating to watch. What does happen when we have annexation and apartheid? You can no longer even pretend that there's an Israel that wants peace. I think it's going to be very hard to push back against things like a growing grassroots demand for respect for human rights and rights for Palestinians as a matter of, you know, rights instead of a political process, and boycotts and all that goes with that. I will say that in parallel, though, the other side has been preparing for this paradigm shift as well. And we see around the world, we see government after government adopting a definition of anti-Semitism, which explicitly defines criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism in an era when we're all about deplatforming hate. So you say anti-Semitism is absolutely indistinguishable from violence and terror, which is indistinguishable from Nazis and white supremacists, and all of it must be deplatformed. I mean, the efforts to take advantage of this moment to once and for all take the Palestinian issue and put it not just back in the box that it was before Madrid, but make it even relegate it to a worse place. There's very powerful energies in play in that direction as well. And I don't know where it ends up, but it is certainly a right moment for things to go, I think, with a lot of energy in both directions.
Thank you, Lara. Khaled.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Lara said. I think, you know, I think one thing we can look forward to is an increasingly polarized and polarizing debate. And on the one hand, that makes politicians very uneasy, very uncomfortable, because now the choice is no longer simply talking about, do you favor a two-state solution or not? Now we're talking about, how do you frame the issue? We're talking about how we talk about the issue, and that itself is changing. We're seeing changes happening on the left. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party is becoming much more assertive in how they are framing this issue, at least at a grassroots level. We are seeing, and I think we're likely to see, despite the attempts to conflate BDS and boycotts with anti-Semitism, or with anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, I think we're going to see more and more of the grassroots sort of lining up on that side of the spectrum. But one, I think, you know, even though it makes people uncomfortable, it does also open up space for debate. We are talking about these issues in ways that we haven't talked about them in a very long time. one of the downsides of the peace process the last 25 years that it has it's really stifled debate. It's, because the focus in American politics has been on this thing that they call a bipartisan consensus on Israel. Republicans and Democrats have to uniformly support Israel's, whether it's security demands or what have you, or simply the positions that it takes in the negotiations with Palestinians. And the collapse of this bipartisan consensus on Israel is opening up space for debate that we haven't had before. And so we could get voices that weren't being heard, including Palestinian voices, in the public discourse, and maybe some more receptivity to those of us who've been trying to point out the many contradictions in this process and its many failings over the years. So, in that sense, maybe we can get a little bit more traction. But I do think that going forward, we're going to see a more polarized debate. We're going to hear more about BDS, as well as about redefining anti-Semitism. And I think there's no way around that, because the old parameters of the debate have collapsed. People can cling to the two-state solution, can cling to the Oslo framework, but on the ground, neither of them exist, as Lara said. And so it's much harder to cling to those pillars when it's clear to more and more people that they're imaginary.
Geoffrey, how do you see Israeli politics being able to keep up with these developments that are no longer bound by this classic sort of two-state solution framework, and moving on to the subjects Lara and Khaled mentioned, apartheid and anti-Semitism, those debates?
Yeah, well, you ask a very good question, because that brings us back to where the occupation is the heart of it, which is the domestic Israeli political and security scene. And what is noteworthy about that scene is that the absolute disappearance as a political force of those elements in Israel prepared to challenge the territorial status quo. For the first time since 1967, there's no political voice left in Israel for those arguing for policies that might be consistent with those that the three of us have articulated. There's no Israeli address for that. More broadly speaking, the Palestinian question has been noteworthy over these last generations for its ability to dominate the international political agenda. It's extraordinary that Palestine has been at the center of concerns for decades. Now that moment has passed. That moment has passed, and the idea of re-energizing the international community to mobilize effectively, not for things like BDS and so forth, but to create a new map of the Middle East, which requires an Israeli retreat, that's a very high hill to climb. And what Trump has done is, in a sense, called the bluff of all of us who have argued ineffectively and over decades that the way to plan the future is to do X, Y, and Z. And he has said, no, it's A, B, and C. And he's won that race. He's won that race. And what we're talking about today for a follow-on, Israel's an apartheid regime, BDS, and so forth. None of these are structured in order to force an Israeli retreat to the June 67 borders. They're energized by the idea to make sure that Israel does not enjoy its conquests. And that's not the same thing. And that's what distinguishes all of these options from real, effective diplomatic action, because they aren't geared towards mobilizing effectively a retreat. And I think that's where we are today. And I don't see anything on the horizon that will, in a sense, upset or recreate a dynamic that we've grown up with and grown old with over these last decades.
Thank you, Jeff, for those comments. And from what I've heard today from these excellent experts is that in some ways, the US policy is definitively going to be different no matter who comes to power, given where we are right now with Jerusalem decision, annexation, everything else. And like last point you mentioned, Jeff, it's no longer maybe about territory, but about what Israel is as a state, as a nation state. How that debate is going to evolve will have implications, and it may not force perhaps territorial change as you mentioned, but this debate might be even more difficult. If you remember South Africa example, perhaps it could have more political implications for the world. I don't want to say a lot more next to these great experts on this topic. So I just want to thank all of you for your time, for listening in from Zoom. We will post this shortly to public social media accounts, YouTube, Facebook, etc. But I want to thank Lara, Khaled, and Jeff for their great comments and their opinion about this. I want to conclude our session here. Thank you so much.